.NET Aspire Community Toolkit with Aaron Powell.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies that are using .NET and Azure. ClearMeasure builds new software and works on mission-critical software systems, rescues failing projects, empowering software delivery with a proven approach. I'm also excited to announce that my latest book is now fully released. The book is about software leadership. It's called The 5 Pillars: Leadership for Effective Custom Software. And the book is for anyone who's attempting to make a custom software team highly effective. And if you want your team to deliver world-class results, this book could be for you. And teams are also doing book studies and discussions around it. And we have a book study guide available. So I'm excited about that. And if you, dear listener, would like a complimentary electronic copy of the book, then just send me an email and I'd be happy to get it for you. Otherwise, you can go on Amazon.com and find it on Kindle, hardcover, softcover, and Audible for audiobook. And for those of you who are in lead architect positions or software executive positions, you might want to join our monthly interactive forums. They are deeply technical sessions, and I really enjoy personally facilitating those. Once a month, you can sign up for those on clearmeasure.com. Our guest today on the show is Aaron Powell. He is a developer advocate at Microsoft, having spent 15 years doing web development. He's seen so much from browser wars, the rise of AJAX, the fall of 20 JavaScript frameworks, and that was just yesterday. Always tinkering with something new. He explores crazy ideas like writing your own implementation of numbers in .NET, creating IOC in JavaScript, or implementing tic-tac-toe using Git commits. And when not sitting at a computer, he can be found spending time with his wife and kids. Aaron, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me on. It's bright and early here in Sydney, so I'm looking forward to a chat.
My pleasure. Isn't it amazing? Yeah, I'm in Central Texas in the U.S. and you're in Sydney in Australia, and we're just the latency is almost nothing. We're just having a great conversation. It's awesome.
Yeah, what a world we live in, and the fact that the Australian internet is going to hold up for at least a conversation for the next however long we hang out for.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you've done so much in your career, but this is the first time we've had you on the podcast, and I want to get into .NET Aspire and the Community Toolkit, and you've done a lot of speaking and work around that. But I like to help the listeners get familiar with you and your background and some of the things. You're in a deeply technical role at Microsoft right now, but if you back up a little bit just to help us get to know you, are there high points in your career that you think kind of are responsible for leading you to the point where you're working on your current projects?
Yeah, so it's been over 15 years since I started working in the industry, and I won't say how past 15. I like saying 15 because it means that I don't sound too old.
Yeah.
And I've been saying 15 years for a few years now. I've been at Microsoft for nearly 6 years, but before that I was doing consulting work. That was a great opportunity just to learn a lot of different kinds of organizations and different business spaces and things like that, and the sorts of problems that are encountered across industries from retail to finance to mining and kind of everything in between. And also, I was lucky enough to have an opportunity when I was working in the consulting company I did the kind of the standard consulting of like the engineering processes and becoming like being a developer going into other teams and stuff like that. But I actually ended up in sales there, and I think a lot of people, particularly people that might be newer into a tech role, are like, "Oh, wait, you're you trained as a software developer, you're a software engineer, and then you went to sales." Like I went into technical sales, and that kind of a lot of people don't necessarily see that as part of the career progression that you might go on. But I actually
Yeah.
found it as a really good opportunity to learn more about the non-code side of what we do. Like how does a business decide on what is important to them from a strategic standpoint? How, if you're trying to work with technical leadership and
Hmm.
business leadership, how you understand what they're wanting to achieve to then turn that into project opportunities and stuff like that. So,
Yeah.
and then I went back into a highly technical role here at Microsoft. So, and I think that's another important thing is that we should look at careers with inside of tech as almost cyclical. You don't have to
Hmm.
go from like a junior developer to a senior developer to a lead developer to a developer team manager to
Yep.
and then just kind of up and up and up in terms of maybe stepping further away from the tools and becoming more managerial. You can then just drop back.
Right.
You can go for to like a highly technical role to a less technical role and then return.
Yeah. Absolutely. And as you were mentioning that example, I was thinking I just took my motorcycle to the mechanic to just do some basic work, and I realized anywhere we go and we talk to someone in the sales role, the good ones actually know what they're talking about because they're experts in that area. It's one thing to talk to a salesperson who can just get me on the schedule to fix my motorcycle. It's another if I'm actually speaking to someone who's actually turned a wrench and actually taken an engine apart because they know what they're talking about. We always want to talk to expert salespeople, not just salespeople who, are friendly.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, like you were saying, like, knowing the ins and outs of the problem really makes that difference between I'm reading a script of this is why this is the right project for you to do, and this is the right set of tools or products or whatever the case may be. To okay, yeah, you like this is the problem that you're trying to solve, and you've clearly thought about what it is like you coming to purchase a service, and then me as the seller of that service, I can be like, okay, well, I see that you've tried these few things or you've
Yeah.
thought about these few things and you've seen why they might not be right. So I'm not going to explore that avenue with you, or we might come back to that down the track because we might look at it from a different perspective and whatnot. Because yeah, you've been through the rigor. You understand the kinds of problems that someone's trying to solve.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you've been doing a lot of work around .NET Aspire and with .NET Conf just happening, and then of course Microsoft Ignite hot on the heels with .NET 9. There's a big major version out there, but a lot of developers don't know about the community toolkit and all of the available modules and add-ons and extensions that are available for what we can do with Aspire right now. So I want to dig in with that and just kind of the lead off. What is the community toolkit? What's the vision for this thing, and how can people get it?
Yeah. So the idea came about a couple of months ago when I was talking with the Aspire engineering team here at Microsoft. Of there's the problem that Aspire is trying to solve. Like having spent time consulting, I really resonate with it. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with Aspire, let's say that you're joining a new project or in an organization, or you're coming to a new company, or you're doing consulting work and going into a new environment completely. And well, how do you get up and running fast? Well, what's the first thing you do? You get a machine, and you're like, okay, well, I got to install the software I'm going to need. I'm going to the right database, the caching, all that sort of stuff. And you go through the wiki, and the wiki's already out of date, so you then have to go and bother other people, and all of a sudden a week has passed. Hey, what'd be great is if I could just clone the repo down and then hit F5, and it is in a way that it has all of the in the code. It knows the right database to use because
Hmm.
it's in there as infrastructure as code. It's
Yeah.
where we want to talk to a Redis cache because we want to do caching. So it's got the right version of the Redis container. It's got debugging tools so I can access the a web UI for inspecting my caches or inspecting my queuing or whatever that may be. That's one of the things that Aspire is trying to solve is that developer loop in a loop where
Hmm.
I want to be able to be contributing. I want to be able to work on a project. I don't want to have to worry about all the stuff that sits around it.
Yeah.
But there's only so many things that the Aspire engineering team themselves are capable of building to solve those sorts of problems. Like they're targeting the most common things that people are doing. So things like caching support, things like databases, queuing, storage, that sort of stuff. The things that are going to be common across the vast majority of applications we build. But there's a huge spectrum of applications that people are building out there with .NET. Some of them are going to want to use, say, event systems that are not just, say, service bus, or they want to incorporate other runtimes. So maybe part of your application is written in Python or Java, or you want to use Golang for part of your distributed application because that is going to be better for a particular type of processing.
Yeah.
Well, we can't expect the product team to be able to build all of those because there's a million and one permutations. So I was talking with the Aspire engineering team, and I was like, you know what would be a really great idea is if we had a centralized place that the open source community that's growing around Aspire, and we're already seeing that starting to crop up, could go to either consume extensions and integrations that people have built, or contribute ones that they want people to be able to discover. Because, discovery can be a really challenging thing to find these packages. There's 500,000 packages on NuGet. You type in Aspire, and where do you start in terms of the packages that you want to use?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we had one centralized project that can help that, and then something that I was really passionate about in doing this was making sure that they were seen at the same level of quality that we get out of the ones that are in the Aspire repo itself.
Yeah.
So testability is there. So they've got a good test coverage, that we've got good high quality documentation. We've got samples and that sort of stuff. So that, me as a consumer of these packages, I can feel confident that this is a well-maintained set of open source projects. It is well tested. It has usages that I can view and I can and play around with. I can contribute to as well.
Gotcha. And I remember, well, with the first one, yeah, you're right. They had just a web application, the Redis cache. And so how are you guys making the decision on what's the kind of the first class in the file new project solution template, and which ones should be in the community toolkit?
Yeah, and that's something that we're definitely working closely with the Aspire engineering team to make sure that we have that clear understanding of when do I propose an integration to the community toolkit, or when do I propose one into the .NET/Aspire repo, where we do have some stuff inside of our docs and our contributing guide on guidance for that. But the high level view is that the Aspire engineering team, the integrations that they provide out of their repo are kind of the ones right now that they see are the ones that they are able to maintain, and they want to now focus more on the framework and the libraries that they ship themselves rather than adding more integrations. So we're kind of the first point of call for if someone wants to add a new integration to Aspire. We've also worked with them so that in the Visual Studio experience of working with Aspire, so if I open up an Aspire application, I want to add a new Aspire package, we actually pop up in the NuGet feed there. So these integrations they're treated as like easily discoverable. They're not first class citizens because we don't do like Microsoft level support or anything like that. But you can find them easily. You're not having to then type in like Aspire and then just scroll through NuGet package feeds to try and figure out where it is. But yeah, we're kind of the place that you would go if you want to look. Well, at least my hope is that we're seen as a collection of the next layer down of commonality that people have. That doesn't mean that everything needs to be in the Aspire Community Toolkit. I'm also very much encouraging people that if they work for an organization that has like an open source project or even a commercial project that they want to have an Aspire integration in, they shouldn't feel like the community toolkit has to be the place to put that. They can build that themselves. We had that conversation around RavenDB as an example.
Gotcha.
And the RavenDB team want to build one themselves. And I'm like, excellent. I would much prefer that you as the subject matter experts build that, own that. But if someone wanted we did Java recently, so we've got a Java hosting integration. Well, we're a good place to put that because there's no better opportunity out there for it.
And I want to point the listeners to where they can get it on. There's a learn.microsoft, but it's also a github.com/community toolkit/aspire. That's the main one. And I'm looking at, I'd encourage the listeners to look at it. I'm looking at in the source directory, and it seems like most of them have this term hosting in the title of it. So is that it just happens to be that most of them are labeled hosting, or that is the vision for this, that there's other things that need to run somewhere and we want to host it as part of our application?
Yeah, the most common integrations that we've come across, even in the Aspire core repo, so the one that's owned by the .NET team, hosting integrations tend to be the most common thing people do. 'Cause .NET is incredible in the amount of stuff that it just provides natively out of the frameworks, out of ASP.NET Core and things like that. So it's more like, well, let's say that I wanted to bring in another database that we currently don't have first class support with inside of the .NET Aspire repo. Um, let's point out, like, say, SQLite, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Like SQLite is something that is supported by Entity Framework, but
Yep.
maybe it doesn't have support in the .NET Aspire repo. Well, that's the kind of thing that we could put into the community toolkit, and there's no real need for a client integration per se because that's handled by Entity Framework. So a lot of our integrations so far have been hosting integrations because that's the thing that people have had. It's the thing that's the hardest to get up and running on a new machine.
Yeah.
We're working with local AI models and Ollama. So, well, like, you've got to know the Ollama container, you've got to pull that down. Then you've got to know the flags if you want to enable GPU support, and then you've got to add models to that. And these are just, a bunch of steps. Well, we can make a C# API that just does that for you, and then you plug that into, say, Ollama Sharp, which we have a client integration for, or you could plug that in with, say, Semantic Kernel, which has native Ollama support. Plug that in with the Microsoft Extensions AI package, which also has Ollama support, or any other Ollama libraries that you might want to integrate with. So we don't need to own those client integrations because there's a heap of them already out there. And the complexity, the hard thing that you tend to tackle is, well, how do I just run this server or this database or this storage model or whatever? Like that, that's harder, and that's where Aspire is really coming in nicely.
Let's explore a couple of these just to illustrate. And you mentioned hosting Ollama. Let's dive into that, because everybody's talking about AI, and of course, as the first people are using OpenAI and Azure AI services, and then they get the monthly bill, and then they're realizing, oh shoot, this is expensive. Well, I don't need the large language model. Maybe I need more of the small language model. Can I just run it inside my app where I'm just using my CPU and video card? Do I really have to use, the
Yeah.
pay per prompt or pay per token? And so is that squarely what this Ollama is meant for, or am I a little bit off?
Yeah, no, that's a really, like, a common thing that we're hitting at the moment. You want to, let's say you want to prototype out, would AI actually be able to help us with this particular thing that we're trying to solve in our
Mm-hmm.
organization? Well, yeah, like, to your point, like, do you want to spin up a service in Azure, or do you want to pay for an OpenAI pro subscription or something like that, where you are, like, it's going to cost you a bunch more money, and if you're only in that experimentation phase, you want to just validate some hypotheses. So running Ollama locally is a really great way to tackle that. Sure, you might not have a model that has the same level of sophistication that you would get out of OpenAI GPT 4.0 or something like that, but you can get some very high fidelity models that are only a couple of gigabytes in size that can run CPU bound. They
Mm-hmm.
don't need, a fleet of GPUs that
Yeah.
like a data center's worth of GPUs to run.
Right.
And that's, so that's what a good use case for playing with Ollama. And even just like that local development experience of, like, I want to, when it's running locally, I want to just do it because I don't need the best or the most complex responses back from my prompt, but I do just want to have, like, some basic back and forth interactions. But then when we deploy it into our, staging environments in our productions, we want to then flip it over to, say, using Azure OpenAI service. So we can do that with Aspire. Locally, we're using a local model, and then in production, we're going to be using a cloud-based model, because a cloud AI model, because that's a better approach.
All right, so let's break this down. So if I want to use one of these, it's just a NuGet package, right? Locally to pull it in.
Yep, it's
Okay.
it's a NuGet package that will quite probably pull down a Docker image.
Mhm.
So, like, let's keep with the Ollama idea. So you would add the community toolkit.aspire.hosting.ollama NuGet package to your app host project in Aspire. And then this adds some extension methods. We go add Ollama. So you add Ollama to your
App host.
your distributed application builder. And then for that Ollama resource, you can then add models to it. When you launch the app host and hit F5 in Visual Studio and run it, the first thing it will do is we'll pull down the container image for Ollama. So it just grabs that off the Docker registry. And then it will start pulling down the models from Ollama into that Docker container that it's now running for you. When you stop, depending on whether or not you've set as persistence, persist that data volume for your container image between restarts, that container image might just like that all just gets blown away at the end of it. And then next time you hit F5 and run, you pull down those images again, or you persist it between runs. So it makes it really easy to have something that is super self-contained. Like I said right at the start, the idea of clone a repo, hit F5, and you haven't had to install anything other than a text editor and the .NET SDK. Right? That's like that. The idea of being able to do that, I think, is really powerful.
Let me make sure I have the configuration right. Locally, I use that hosting.ollama NuGet and enter the code into my app host. And when I F5, when I start in Visual Studio, it's going to start up. If I start it with the new template and I've got a web application, then it's going to start up the web application and another Docker container that's running Ollama and using Ollama sharp. I just write a little bit of C# to call over to this other process running in the other container with whatever named available model that I've chosen. And on startup, it's downloaded locally, that model, the model that I chose, and it's up and running. And so I'm sending it a prompt, and it just gives my Ollama sharp, the code in my web application, the response, and everything's running only locally on my computer. Is that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So assuming you've already got the image, the container image pulled and the model, you can do that 100% offline. So imagine you're traveling over the holidays and you're like, oh, I wanted to have a play around with this. So you make sure you have all your stuff, like your image and your model already downloaded, and then you can fire it up on your laptop on a flight to go visit your family and just watch your battery life drain radically as you're trying to run CPU bound language models, but you can do it.
Well, there's so many cases though where a large language model is just completely overkill. If I don't need a model that's been trained with a ton of stuff, if I'm really just asking for some analysis on something where I'm giving it all of the data in the prompt. For example, if I have some customer comments or customer feedback or any kind of text, and I'm asking, hey, is this customer generally happy or pissed off? Just sentiment analysis where that doesn't require GPT-4 just to do a simple problem like that, right? And I'm guess it doesn't really tax even my local CPU that much just for that small of a task. So I'm guessing that forget using it in Azure, even in production for those types of tasks, this would be perfectly fine, even in production, would it not?
Yeah, we're still working out. So obviously, the go to production story with this is an interesting one because you've got to then obviously consider things like what is your security modeling and stuff like that. Like the last thing you want to be doing is deploying something that's running a language model that is then got a public HTTP endpoint. Now, really nice thing with, or particularly a public HTTP endpoint that might not have security on it. So we're trying to figure out, well, if you are wanting to use those small language models, what is the best way to host those in a cloud environment, or even like in a public on-prem style environment, because that's what you're hosting in, and it poses an interesting challenge because that kind of falls beyond where Aspire necessarily is going to solve it. But there's things in Aspire that will take care of, say, the what is and isn't publicly exposed. So particularly when it's deployed to Azure, it relies a lot on service discovery and not having public endpoints for things that don't require public endpoints, as an example.
And with Aspire, correct me if I'm wrong, but the assumed hosting model is pretty much Azure Container Apps. Is it not?
Yeah, so the way Aspire works is that it has two major stages when you're wanting to deploy an application. The first thing is it generates a deployment manifest. So this is it's a JSON representation of the infrastructure you've defined in
Hmm.
your app host. So what are the projects like your .NET API backend, your web front end, and so on and so forth? What services are you leveraging? So things like you might be running a SQL database, and locally that's been running as a SQL server inside of a container, but you'd be deploying that into production. You would define what a production deployment model would look like for that, and then you would have packages that provide more metadata to this JSON file that gets generated. That JSON file is then ingested by some kind of tool that is then going to deploy it to a hosting environment. For Azure, so we have a first-class story around deploying to Azure using the Azure Developer CLI or AZD. So you can do AZD up. It will then generate that manifest. It will then generate the resources in Azure. It will use container apps for anything that is an application or a container-based hosting. But you can then also integrate that with, say, Azure Redis cache because you want to use caching, or Azure SQL because you're wanting to use a SQL database backend,
Hmm.
Azure Storage because you want somewhere to put files. But there's also an open source project out there called Aspirate, which will target Kubernetes clusters. So let's say that you're wanting to deploy into a Kubernetes environment. And that might be an on-prem Kubernetes environment. So you can use Aspirate to generate out all the appropriate YAML files that you need to provide to the Kubernetes deployment manifest, and then deploy that into Kubernetes environment, which I think is really cool. And that kind of speaks to that flexibility of, like, you know, deployment may be a story that we can tackle with Aspire, but while the .NET team is going to focus on where they have their expertise, which is going to be that kind of integration into Azure, because
Yeah,
we can
of
work with
course.
the Azure teams. But that's not. But it's designed in a way that you could plug in to an on-premise Kubernetes cluster, or AWS. There is some work happening so that you could deploy into AWS using the CDK. And if someone wanted to build one similarly for Google Cloud or any of the other hosting providers out there, you could definitely do that.
I want to ask you about another one of these. Well, I see one hosting.activemq, and then I see masstransit.rabbitmq. That's a very common for people who are using queues, topic subscriptions, using mass transit, or using in-service bus. They want to use Azure Service Bus in Azure, but of course, okay, locally, well, I don't have Azure Service Bus locally. What the heck do I do? I need some type of corollary. And are both of those just meant to be developer level story, or are those also meant to be, hey, let's host the actual production queue in a container, in a production environment?
And it kind of depends on what is going to be the right way for you. In my opinion, you'd be better off moving to a SaaS option for that queue management. So
Yeah.
yeah, like you'd be moving to Service Bus if you're deploying to Azure, or you would if you're deploying into like one of the other clouds, then they're equivalent sort of thing. But let's say you are building a hybrid environment, so some of your services are going to be running locally and some of them are going to be in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in that case, you've like your backend stuff, because you're running it as, say, inside of a DMZ. Maybe you would run ActiveMQ inside of a container, inside of a Kubernetes cluster that you're running on premise, because that's just like you just need that communication between your on-premise resources. You don't actually
Mm-hmm.
need the stuff that's deployed into the cloud to be talking to a queue. So yeah, it would definitely be an option to go down that route. And this is where kind of that flexibility comes in of, you work if we provide enough options for the different kinds of applications that people are building, then people can make that informed decision about what's going to be right for their infrastructure, for their application design, for their security modeling that they're wanting from what they're going to be deploying. We don't want to be overly prescriptive that you have to do everything using Azure-based resources, because
Yeah.
let's be honest, not
Right.
everyone is going to need to go down that route.
Right.
Particularly people that are still using that on-prem because it's the right thing for their organization.
Right. Totally. Backing up a little bit, you mentioned the developer story and configuring some of these and then hitting F5 and starting it up. Um, and I hear a lot of your peers and people, and even David Fowler and people on the Aspire team saying, "Oh, hit F5 and start it up." What is the rationale for starting as the normal flow with debugging versus Control F5, which is starting without debugging when you think about the inner developer loop? Or does Aspire somehow change that dynamic?
I think the most reason that I default to F5 is I know the competency I have in my own programming skills and that there is going to be a bug. So I'm going to need to be debugging that at some point. And
Okay.
so I just default to but no, it doesn't really change that too much. So if you want to run without debugging, probably the only real difference I see is that because the application you launch is going to be the Aspire app host, rather than the individual web applications, the minimal APIs, the
Mm-hmm.
Blazor server applications, or
Yep.
whatever the case may be. Um, then attaching all the debugging to all of those. So if we think of this without Aspire, if you're building a distributed application and you have a couple of services, well, you end up making multiple profiles with inside of Visual Studio to
Yeah.
launch, the certain
Right.
services. I want some of these debugging, I want some of these not
Yeah.
debugging, or it's not unrealistic that we would have a project with, say, half a dozen different backends to it, because
Mm-hmm. Sure.
we've done that in a distributed way. We're using queues to pass messages back and forth between the services rather than just
Right.
building a monolith. So how do we make sure that we're able to debug that without too much additional overhead? So, but with Aspire, because it's launching all of those processes for you, it can be just a little bit more cumbersome to go back and find them, because you weren't the one that launched them. Something else launched them on your behalf. So you don't have that immediate observation of what those processes were. So you spend a bit more. It can be just a bit more clunky to go through that attached to process dialogue. So that's why like I said, that and my knowledge of, or my experience in my own coding
Yeah.
is that I'll probably need a debugger. But no, yeah, you can definitely use the Control F5 experience, and it works in a very similar manner.
Yeah, that attached to process dialogue, I think it looks the same as it has for the last 20 years in Visual
Yeah.
Studio. But I want to make sure I understand. The app host is the Visual Studio startup project, right? And so when I hit
Yeah.
F5, it's going to start that process as debugger, and then it spins up the other ones. Does it also attach every other running application to the debugger on immediately?
Yeah, so the app host is the orchestrator for the distributed application. So it uses a type called distributed application host, which is analogous to the web application host that you would get if you're building, say, a minimal API with ASP.NET. But because it's a distributed one, it's designed to run multiple applications. So you add multiple applications to it. So yeah, so rather than having multiple startup projects configured in Visual Studio, or just launching just a single project because that's just the one you want to run, you launch the app host every time, whether it with or without the debugger attached, depending
Yeah.
on what kind of launch experience you're after. And then it will go ahead and it will look at the resources that you define within it. So you bring in your other web projects that you've got in there, maybe console applications, back services, as well as the external resources such as databases, caches, etc. And what it will do is it will run all of those concurrently. Like behind the scenes, things will get started in Docker containers. If they're Docker containers, if they're a console application, it will launch that executable. If it's a ASP.NET application, it will launch the web host for it, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
If you're running with debuggers, it will then attach the debuggers to all of the .NET projects that it's capable of attaching a debugger to. It can also launch things like Node projects or Python. And I said with the community toolkit, we can bring in Java and stuff like that. They won't get the debuggers attached just because now we're talking multi-language, multi-runtime debugger support, and
Yep.
that's a rabbit hole in and of itself. But at the very least, you can start your Node.js single page front end if you want. Like, you've got a React application, that's actually your front end instead of a Blazor WebAssembly.
Yeah.
Well, it will run that for you, and then it will provide, say, the HTTP endpoint for your backend service, so that you can you've got that URL with the port and the protocol on it, so that you don't have to then hard code config values everywhere of, okay, if I want to talk to this API, it's going to be on localhost and this port number, and that API is on a different port number, and so on and so forth.
Right. We automatically have that configuration available to us. This makes me think of full system acceptance tests, which have always been difficult from a configuration perspective, where we have not just unit tests and integration tests, but those in-unit or X-unit test suites that are the full system tests that use Playwright or Selenium to pull up a web browser and simulate a user actually pulling up a page, clicking on buttons, doing things, or from a queue perspective, uploading a PDF file, which a backend service then scans and OCRs and picks apart, whatever the process is, the endpoint. It's like a full system test scenario, and all these tests. There has to be configuration so that those tests know how to contact the application in a particular environment. I'm wondering if this would be a great use case for the community toolkit, because if that test suite was inside this hosting shell, if it was an Aspire project and it got spun up in a container, and the startup process was execute the tests, it, just like any other one of these components, it has access to all of the configuration for how to contact the different parts of the application. And that seems like it would greatly simplify the configuration burden for those types of full system tests.
Yeah, in fact, that's actually what we do in the community toolkit, because we've got so many different things that we're writing tests for. And I said earlier on that one of the things that I was really passionate about or I really pushed for when we were building the community toolkit, is that I wanted it to be well tested,
Yeah.
because there's going to be so many things that people are going to add to it. So what we actually do is part of contributing an integration to the community toolkit is that you have to write a sample project for that. So with the example of say Ollama, we've got one that's going to load up some models, and it has a little web UI and that kind of stuff. Well, part of our test suite is that's in an app host. We actually start that app host. And then we will we'll leverage the health check feature of .NET Aspire, so that we will wait until the container is up and running and the model has been downloaded, so those resources have become healthy, and then we will inspect them. We could write we could send prompts to it, and actually, to your point of your end-to-end system test, you can definitely do that. And with the community toolkit, we don't have anything quite that level of complexity, but I've got other projects, other open source projects that I've done, and sample applications where, we start up. It could be like half a dozen different backend resources. You could start up multiple containers all simultaneously, and because we have service discovery built into Aspire, it will then know that this is where all those different backend API endpoints are. This is how you talk to the database, to the cache, to the queue, etc.
Yeah.
And then you can drop Playwright in front of that and have it execute the web UI. Or if things are exposed by APIs, you can upload a file to that API and then observe what's happening on the queue through its logging. Or you can query against it because you've got access to those resources, and you can pull back their connection strings and inside of your test. This is actually one of the ones we do in the community toolkit. Is we have some SQL integrations that uses the DAC packs and provisions databases using DAC packs. So the test is that we run the Aspire app host, which will provision the database and then load the DAC pack to then set up all the tables and everything. We then use what's available from Aspire to get the connection string to that database, which is running in a container, which is completely transient and will be destroyed at the end of the test. But we then connect to that database using just SQL command, execute command to then query to make sure that the tables are there. And that is our acceptance test. That we're like, the point of this integration is to initialize a database with a particular database schema and anything else that the DAC pack defines. So to validate that test runs, well, let's do that, and then let's connect to the database and query to make sure that it did what we expected it to do. So you could do that with an API endpoint.
Yeah.
It's right into the database, and then you write a test that is then going to inspect that database using the connection that is provided from Aspire to make sure the correct record ended up in there.
Nice. Yeah, transient database. Now, is that using SQL Express, SQL Local DB inside the container? What's it using?
This is running the SQL Server container image. So it's running full SQL Server that you.
Oh, the full edition.
Which is so there's, because you can pull down a Linux container image for SQL Server, So
Okay.
that's what we do. So it's got everything that's
Nice.
available in SQL Server if you wanted to run that in a contained environment. So like in theory, you could do full text searching
Yeah.
against that. So like if that was the kind of thing you needed out of your database and it was something you were leveraging inside of a test, well, you could do that. And you could do that kind of end to end, like, load it up with however many hundreds of records you wanted and then perform a full text search against it if you wanted.
That is brilliant because there's not only queues, but the Azure SQL database, there are these services where, yes, in production, we need to manage the long-lived nature of the data and make sure that those things are in order. But when it comes to tests or any process in the DevOps environment leading up to production, we're just throwing things away, spinning it back up. We just need validation. We just need the answer. Okay, we changed some stuff. Did we break anything? That's really what we need. We don't need to. And the more we futz with Azure SQL and all the configuration, spin it up, destroy it. One, it's slow. But yeah, if we could do all that, and it sounds like we can now inside a container, that sounds much, much faster, a quicker turnaround time.
It is. It's also cheaper, right? Because
Yeah.
you don't have to deploy resources into a cloud environment. Now, look, if you want to be a real purist, then sure, you're not actually acceptance testing against what you would be running in production because you're running not Azure SQL, you're running a SQL Server,
Right.
which has some slight nuance differences. But from an acceptance test, you have to have those trade-offs, and if you can do that in a much shorter time frame, like I think our CI process for the community toolkit, which runs Windows and Linux builds and tests across both of those for around about 20 different integrations, and we've got over 100 tests. We do that in, I think it's about 15 minutes.
Nice.
And we're standing up. There's probably a dozen different container images that we use across all of that. And I actually found out there is a limit to the amount of disk space you can use in a GitHub Actions. It's 14 gig, and we were actually hitting 14 gig, particularly because of Ollama, because, well,
right.
Turns out language models are kind of large, and you like pulling down language models inside of an integration test. Like, well, actually, there's another really good use case. Like, you want to just do some validation that your like the basis of an AI process could work. Do that entirely in a model running in a container inside of a test that is just plugged straight into the rest of your application pipeline without having to stand up an Azure OpenAI service or use an OpenAI account or whatever the case may be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's really like when we first got that working, I was like, wow, this is so cool. Like where was this when I was doing consulting like 7-8 years ago? And you're like, okay, we've just done a big feature edition. Cross our fingers, it's going to work in production.
Right. Exactly. Well, this is fascinating. I could ask so many more questions, but I think we're over time just on this episode. But we'll include a link to all of those resources that we talked about in the show notes, the actual community toolkit on GitHub. Also links where you can listener find Aaron Powell. And wow, Aaron, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us what's going on with Aspire in the community toolkit. This is a fantastic advancement.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And yeah, like if people want to get involved, yeah, definitely check out the repo. I'm probably a little bit biased, but I think we've got a good amount of contributing guides, and definitely keen if people want to get involved and help us build out, because I think there's so many different ways we can build applications, and I want to make sure that everyone has the ability to leverage Aspire where it's going to make sense in their projects.
So it sounds like there's two calls to action. One is contribute to this GitHub repository, but another is if there's a component, if there's something that is needed, this provides plenty of examples where another GitHub project and then thereby a NuGet package could be spun up just totally independent using the same mechanism, so that it's, are we calling these .NET Aspire plugins? What's the official term that we're calling these things?
Integrations.
Integrations. Okay.
They changed the naming a couple of months ago. It was originally called components, but now it's called integrations. And every time we accidentally say components internally, we have to put $1 in the jar.
Yeah. Okay. So the hibernating rhinos folks are doing their RavenDB integration on their own and more. Okay, so those either contribute to this one or make your own integration, stand it up, make it available, get it onto NuGet.org, and overall the ecosystem will just grow and grow. So naming conventions. If someone's going to spin up their own and we're searching for it inside NuGet, is there a desired naming convention just so that they're easily discoverable?
So the generalized pattern that we've got is that, so for a hosting integration, it would have so we would have Aspire somewhere within inside of the package ID and the namespacing. Obviously, we can't start everything with Aspire because that's a reserved namespace from the Aspire team themselves. So like my name or my awesome project .aspire, and then if it's a hosting integration, it would be .hosting, just so that we know that that's the one that is going to be providing something kind of like a server side thing. And a client integration would just be the name of the NuGet package that we're wrapping. So, for example, the Ollama Sharp, it's just Community Toolkit Aspire Ollama Sharp because it's a client integration, whereas the Ollama server one is Community Toolkit Aspire Hosting Ollama.
Makes sense.
Aspire Hosting Ollama, or it's Aspire providing a client integration.
Yeah, either hosting the integration or the way to call and communicate with the integration.
Correct. Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. This is great. I'm pumped up. This is good stuff. So,
cool.
Wow. Thanks for coming on the Azure and DevOps podcast. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.